Hey everyone, welcome back. We have reached the topic of personality traits. So we want to talk a little bit about why this way of thinking about personality is attractive, why it has been attractive for many centuries, and why it will remain most likely a very appealing, attractive way of approaching psychology, approaching human beings, thinking about people. We should note that it is not the only way to think about psychology. It's one way, and it happens to be a way of thinking in psychology that easily extends itself. It's kind of one of those fields, one of those ways of thinking, one of those types of theorizing that devours other fields, wants to extend itself into fields that are not related to it necessarily. For example, you might encounter people who begin having some kind of expertise or having some research, a line of research begins in personality traits, but they want to move into maybe thinking style and say, what type of personality trait is inclined towards religiosity or inclined towards superstition? And I say, okay, if you have this kind of personality trait, these traits, if they are dominant in you, then you will be prone to superstition or towards this type of religious belief. It goes into political theory. Political psychology can be devoured if you're not careful. And the discussion of political thought, political psychology might just be reduced to what type of person you are. So I'm the kind of person who is inclined towards liberalism or conservatism. That is a kind of reduction to personality traits. So everything becomes about what type of traits you have, what type of traits are dominant in you. And then that way of thinking replaces the kind of arguments you might be willing to have. You might be open to having arguments. Otherwise, if you don't pigeonhole yourself in terms of a kind of dominant personality trait. So when I say personality traits is a topic or a field of research, is a style of thinking that can devour other fields, what I mean is that it will stop other fields from contributing something genuine that they are capable of contributing. Instead, it makes everything about personality traits. So anyways, let's get into today's presentation. Let me begin with sharing my screen, the slides. Let's see if I remember what I have. Okay, chapter 13, personality traits. This is where we are. Next topic will be the self. And after that, conformity and so on and so forth. So today we want to talk about why trait theory of personality is appealing. What are some of the reasons that would lead us into trait theories, studying trait theories, becoming personality researchers that adopt this way of thinking? We want to talk a little bit about the historical background, where this form of knowing, this form of thinking comes from, and two kinds of problems with it. Problems of method and methodology, and conceptual problems, more theoretical problems. So why trait theory to begin with? Some people might say, we may not agree with this, you might hold other opinions, but some people might say psychology aims to understand persons. So that implies that if you're strictly holding on to that definition, psychology has a unique contribution in understanding people, individuals, not environments, not society, not history. And therefore, what we want in psychology is understanding what is stable about persons. If you understand things about persons that are not stable, that change from moment to moment, that might not be genuine psychological knowledge, because you can use it as a basis for prediction for interacting with other people. So you want something that is relatively stable. You can speak about what you're studying without that thing changing on you too quickly. So that's one way of motivating trait theory of personality. And if you Watch people talk about each other, talk about other people. Everyday psychological judgments are usually about some personality trait. So we hear someone say, she's confident, or he is shy, or she's open-minded, he's outspoken, she's adventurous, he is creative, etc. Okay, so these are particular judgments, so one statement about one aspect of a person. And when somebody is described as creative, you don't know everything about them. You understand, we assume that each person has different sides to their personality. So it is not beyond our imagination to say that somebody is very good at their creative work, but they are kind of a jerk otherwise in their interaction with other people. Somebody might be very confident in their personal relationships, but they may not be as confident in their work, or they may not be as conscientious in their work. So this is the idea that, yes, you can make judgments, and these judgments don't say everything about, they don't give you all information about a person, about all of their traits. So each trait is isolated from other traits that the personality consists of. Given the complexity of human personality, all the differences among people, how complex people are, in so many ways we can be different from each other, it is useful to have a simple framework for thinking about people. One such framework is the so-called Big Five trait theory. The idea is that we can understand a person, or we can begin to understand people with respect to their score, quantifiable position along 5 dimensions. One useful analogy is to think about personality in terms of taste. So taste is also, it can have maybe 4 or 5 dimensions of taste. A naive person who is tasting food or tasting wine, they might just see one thing, but somebody who is an expert in tasting wine, tasting food, they might be better at analyzing that taste in terms of its elements. So we can identify a taste based on how much of the basic tastes or basic elements of tastes are in that. So we can say there's too much bitterness in it, or there's not enough sourness in this taste and sweetness. So these are, how much bitterness is in the taste is independent, presumably, of how much sweetness is in it, because those two come from different elements of taste. This, by the way, is not a very accurate map of how we taste. You know, the sensory process of taste goes on, not necessarily according to this simplistic map, but we are using an analogy. Now, let's get back to the history of thought about human personality. We have, at least this form of thinking goes back to Hippocrates, who talked about types of bodily fluids, so chemical substance, or humors as they're called. And these humors you can have too little of them, or too much of them, or the right amount of them. And these humors correspond to psychological tendencies, psychological moods. These 4 substances correspond or are associated with the activities of the psyche, the tendencies of the psyche. It's a relationship between the material side of the human body and the psychological side, the mental life. We have also in the history, we have Franz Gall, who proposed phrenology as a framework for studying types of people. So he wasn't talking about chemical substances or fluids that you might have too much of or too little of. Instead, he talked about the structure of the brain and imbalances in the growth, different areas of the brain. So he believed that he can measure bumps on a person's skull, which indicate brain growth, which themselves indicate what type of trait, what trait is dominant in your personality. Other examples could name William Sheldon, who identified 3 types of physical structure of the body. He called them endomorphic, ectomorphic, and mesomorphic. What is a leap in Sheldon's thinking is not, the leap is not in describing body types. The leap is to associate body types with psychology, with personality. So that is the part that is questionable, that raises a lot of skepticism. If you say, for example, endomorphic people are easygoing and sociable. So you are talking about a one-to-one mapping. If you just look at a person's body type, you immediately can make predictions about what type of personality they have. So it's very simplistic, but the appeal is precisely in its simplicity. So you have a way of categorizing people based on something that is not itself personality traits, like body type, like bodily fluids, humors, or bumps along the skull. And then you can map those onto traits. Contemporary psychology, needless to say, contemporary psychology does not take these old theories by Hippocrates, by Gall, by Sheldon seriously. So nobody subscribes nowadays to Franz Gall or to Hippocrates' theory of personality traits. But the form of knowledge continues to be both appealing and actively pursued by contemporary researchers. So what is that form of knowledge? The form of knowledge that is still being pursued is that there are underlying factors that cause stable personality traits that persist across situations. This is the underlying form of knowledge, so the style of knowledge. That's why we still refer to Hippocrates, to Gall, to Sheldon, when we are introducing the topic of personality traits, because they share the form of knowledge with what is currently being done, what is currently held by the majority of personality psychologists. So what is now in the Big Five theory? You can introduce it using statistics, but you don't have to use statistics to introduce the idea. This is, I'm taking this from a paper by Colin DeYoung with the title Cybernetic Big Five Theory. It's a really nice introduction if you want to see contemporary thought on Big Five theory. It's very sophisticated. It tries to link neuroscience and personality, science of personality. So what DeYoung does in introducing Big Five in terms Big Five is in terms of motivational systems, and within each of us are several motivational systems. So we begin with the observation that we emotionally react to situations. We experience our reality effectively. We care. That's one of our first observations, phenomenological observations pointed out by many people, including Heidegger, most notably. We care. That's our relationship to the world, to reality. So we could continue and say we can maybe categorize people based on what they care about, or what they care about the most, what they care about not as much. So that's one way to describe the differences between people, how you and I are different from each other. So you put care at the center of our thinking and say, okay, what types of things people care about? So we care about, for example, getting some pleasant external stimuli from the environment, avoiding negative experiences, threats, punishments. There's things that we want to pursue. There are things that we want to avoid. What else? We want to ideally have some cognitive, informational engagement. We don't want to be bored. We want to maybe do something interesting. So cognitive engagement. We want our minds to be engaged, play video games, solve a crossword puzzle, hear some jokes, watch a TV show, watch a movie. So these are cognitive engagements, things that are interesting. We want to engage with them. Fourth, we, to varying degrees, we care about having long-term goals, having some long-term structure for our lives. And finally, we care, again, to varying degrees, about cooperating with others, successfully working together with other people. So these five categories of things that we care about are labeled by the Big Five theorists as, respectively, extroversion, neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. So if you are Too open, you're high on openness. That's how you're described. If you care too much about avoiding negative experiences, negative stimuli, if you focus too much on threats and punishments, then you are described as high on neuroticism, and so on and so forth. Now let's go around this circle and talk about the labels that you might give someone who is too low on along one of these dimensions. What happens if you're too low on extroversion? Then the label is reserved, or its synonyms. If you're too low on neuroticism, the label would be unflappable. If you're too low on openness, the label would be unimaginative. For being low on conscientiousness, it's unreliability. And too low on agreeableness would be selfish. Okay, if you'd like to learn more about this discussion, one way to begin is calling the Jung's paper, Cybernetic Big Five. So these are motivational systems that divide our discussion of personality in terms of personality traits. Each personality trait is corresponding to a motivational system, one category of things that you care about. And you might not care as much about one of these. That motivational system might be weak, and some other motivational system might be going on overdrive, and that will be very dominant for you. Okay, now we have reached the problems, methodological problems. One methodological problem is what to focus on when you want to get to know someone. Do you focus on their words or do you focus on their action? So do you focus on how people describe themselves or how they behave when you let them engage and make decisions? Another question is, do you focus on self-report or do you focus on the reports given by their friends or by their family members? Another question is, when do you stop looking for these motivational systems? Do you want fewer? Do you want to maybe go from 5 to 2 or 5 to 3? Or do you want to go from 5 to 10? So which one is more desirable as a scientific goal? You want fewer number of traits or larger number of traits? Which one is better? Which one represents an advance in the field? Are we accurate when we judge our own personality? And what happens when we judge our own personality, when we use a label to describe ourselves? What are we really doing? So I've heard a lot of students in my teaching career, in my former teaching career, I used to hear a lot of students describe themselves as shy. They said, I don't want to make new friends, or I cannot make new friends because I'm too shy. I don't want to ask questions in the class because I'm too shy. I don't want to participate in group discussions or group projects because I'm shy. Do you act shy because you believe you are shy? Or do you believe you are shy because you're actually shy? And our beliefs about our personality false and simplistic? And are they, even you can go further and say, are they excuses? Do you believe you are shy because you already feel more comfortable if you use that as an excuse? Maybe it's a little bit outside of your experience. Maybe you haven't done group projects, you haven't asked questions in the class. And because you haven't done that, you resort to this way of talking about yourself. You, instead of saying, I haven't done that before, I find it uncomfortable, you talk about it as part of your personality, as part of what you are, what type of being you are. And once you do that, what does that give you? It gives you a really nice excuse. Say, I'm shy. Or we can say, I'm low on conscientiousness, so I can't be reliable. Don't ask me to be reliable. I took a big 5 personality trait and I scored really low on conscientiousness. So from now on, my friends should not expect, it will be very unfair for them to expect anything from me, any reliability from me. Or I scored high on openness, therefore I have to do some creative project. That's why I never succeeded in office work. So these are, there are things that you can do with it. These are not just news that you receive, information that have no impact on our decisions. We actually do things with these judgments. we take next steps based on them. You can ask, you can ponder, reflect with your questions. Have you ever entered a new environment, a new city, a new country? Has this ever happened to you? You've entered a new city, somewhere that nobody knows you. And maybe in that new context, you felt like you could be anyone. You could be any type of person. You could be someone who is very different from your old self, because much of what you were doing, much of your stability was actually in order to seem reliable to other people who know you already. So your parents, your siblings, your best friends, your colleagues, because they already have formed expectations about you, have already formed judgments of you, something that we might feel like doing is to fulfill those expectations, continue to act according to what other people already know about us. And in a new place, you suddenly feel liberated from all those pressures and judgments and expectations. Now you can really start and be creative. So when there is stability in your behavior, what is the cause of that stability? Is it your personality? Is it something within you? Or is it in the environment, or is it in the interaction, in the relationships that you have formed with the environment? Methodological questions also include questions about the culture, the cultural contexts of like Big Five. So researchers have argued that in the Western context of research, the birthplace of Big Five is Western psychology. And researchers who have been more attentive to the East, to the Asian communities, they have argued that some traits have been neglected. So there's an important trait, namely interpersonal relatedness, how much you feel related to people around you. This is different from agreeableness. When you point out something like that, are you pointing out differences between the cultures, or are you pointing to something that was identified because some of the Eastern cultures were more sensitive to something that was a human universal? So interpersonal relatedness was neglected in Western academic context, not because it doesn't exist in that context, but because it was downplayed in favor of some other traits, like the Big Five. Conceptual problems are related to actually the methodological and conceptual problems. There are a lot of overlap between them. So conceptual problems include the questions about causes and effects. What comes first, personality or behavior? What is the dynamic? What is the relationship between stability and change? What is the relationship between doing something new, making a new decision, exploring a new part of your life, new part of the world? How does that relate to the things that you repeat? Do you need to repeat certain things? Do you need to have habits, some kind of reliability and stability as the background against which you introduce change into your life? So these are conceptual problems about traits. And another conceptual problems, again related to methods, is the approach to thinking about personality. There are two general approaches, one called the ideographic approach, the other the nomothetic approach. What is different between these two approaches is what they consider to be the primary point of departure. So the ideographic approach begins with case studies, begins by focusing on individuals. And it says you don't need to focus on a group of 100 people, 200 people, 1,000 people to gain lots of data. You don't need to actually rely on big data. If you focus on individual cases, and if you observe them carefully, you can learn a lot about personality. So that's the ideographic approach. Ideographic approach traces the behavior, the development of individuals across time. So you want to learn a lot about one person. By contrast, the nomothetic approach wants to get a lot of information from a large sample, 100 people, let's say, 200 people. And based on the group, you gain a kind of knowledge that you could not get if you just look at one person. It would be interesting to say that the ideographic approaches don't result in something like Big Five or trait theories, because the birthplace of trait theories is actually statistics. It's the application of the statistical method and finding out that variations along one dimension do not have a statistical relationship to variations in another dimension. So if you know people's score, if you know one individual's score on openness, for example, you cannot predict based on their openness score, cannot predict something about their conscientiousness or any other of the four dimensions. Something else we should talk about briefly is the influence of intellectual context at the time. The science of personality trait goes back to, is intimately linked with the application of statistics. As we have already discussed, Francis Galton was a major figure in the application of statistics to social sciences. His student, Carl Pearson, also major figure in the development of statistics and its application. Charles Spearman, if you have taken introductory courses to statistics, you have heard these names. And one of his students of Spearman, was Raymond Cattell. And that's the figure that is the beginning, the origin, one of the origin points of Big Five personality traits. So Cattell's contribution already becomes kind of recognizable. You recognize contemporary trait theory in the works of Cattell. And we had people like Edward Thorndike, who wrote in 1911 a book titled Individuality. And here's a often quoted passage from that book, Individuality. So this is really central assumption. Let's read. All intelligible differences are ultimately quantitative. The difference between any two individuals, if describable at all, is described by comparing the amounts which person A, possesses of various traits with amounts which B possesses of the same trait. So you take one trait and you compare the score of person A with the score of person B. In intellect and character, differences of kind between one individual and another turn out to be definable, if defined at all, as compound differences of degrees. So if you feel like there are qualitative differences between individuals, what we need to do, according to Thorndike, is we need to dissect them in terms of quantifiable elements. So this is a way of description that cuts across individuals. So A, B, C, if you look at the horizontal lines here, I've taken this figure from a paper by James Lamiel published in 2000, which I will refer to in a moment. So the vertical lines, each vertical line is a person. And you don't really care about those vertical lines. What you only care about is two attributes, which in this graph are indicated by M and N, those two horizontal lines. So you sample only each individual only insofar as they are related to, the measurement of two attributes like creativity or openness. As you can say, oh, this is a score on M, this is the score on another trait, N. So you really exclude almost everything about individuals except for those quantifiable elements. So this is a more general way of describing ways of approaching personality, ways of approaching people, the study of people. You can focus on attributes or you can focus on individuals. If you focus on attributes, you can focus on one attribute and examine many people with respect to that one attribute. For example, you want to learn about the distribution of IQ or the distribution of creativity. And so you pick a large sample of people and you only care about that attribute in all of those people. Or you might be interested in a combination of attributes, 2 or more attributes, and see how those attributes co-vary or how they might be independent from each other. Now, let's say you're interested in individuals. Then you might be interested in one individual or multiple individuals. If you are interested in one individual, then you don't limit yourself to just one of their attributes. You want to learn about many different attributes of that one individual. If you want to compare 2 individuals, you compare them across many, many, many different attributes, as many as you want. You won't limit yourself to just one trait or one behavior, one tendency. So this, as I said, James Lamiel has discussed this extensively in many different publications. This one, which includes these figures, is called a periodic table of personality elements. And in that and other works, James Lamiel gives a lot of credit to one of his influences, namely William Stern, who talked about these different approaches in studying personality. You can focus on attributes, but that's not the only way. So Big Five personality, Big Five trait theory of personality is a way of focusing on 5 attributes. You actually don't care as much about individuals, at least within that framework. So that's really important. Why this way of focusing on attributes became more dominant in psychology had also something to do with the influence of social contexts and economical contexts. So mandatory schooling happened around the same times that these applied statisticians were working. There was need for testing students' ability or inability for learning. The point was also after the Industrial Revolution, and there were many issues with employment, and employers were interested in testing very efficiently the aptitude of people who were potentially going to work in their factory or in their workplace offices. There was military interest pairing people with the right duty, something that they were prepared to do. So the ideal tests of personality, of aptitude, of attributes in general, ideal tests were those that were quick and those that did not need much training. So you could train someone within a day and send them out into the field and give, so they could give questionnaires to people to fill. It takes a lot more training to prepare someone to do case studies, to focus on actual individuals and many of their attributes. But if you focus on attributes, especially if you have a quantitative approach, then you don't really need to give much training to people who are working under you. And this is another reason why quantitative approaches and trait theories are really popular, because professors and researchers, principal investigators in different universities or research firms, they can do very minimal, almost no training, and have lots of graduate students and research assistants working under them, because you basically are not demanding much intellectual work from your assistants. So Big Five came out of large amounts of data focusing on attributes that presumably are quantifiable. And then people found that these 5 traits are not statistically, they are not related to each other. They don't predict each other. If you know the score on neuroticism, that's unrelated. It has no impact on scores on other 4 factors. So an important point here I should emphasize, the Big Five traits are derived from aggregate data and not from individuals. If you focus on one individual, like have you ever interacted with somebody for a very long time, like your best friend or a romantic partner, and then divided them in terms of independent traits? That just does not happen. The independent traits and their independence comes out of the aggregate data, comes out of zooming out and considering not one person, not 2 people, but hundreds of people. It is at that level that we begin to think about something like Big Five. So, for example, in the aggregate data, agreeableness and extroversion may vary independently. They are separable statistically. But does that mean that they are separable in a human life, in the life of one individual? So let me give you an example. Let's imagine this person named Jim. Jim is a student, and he has a life as a student. He has a life as a friend, with his relationships with his friends, and he has a life working also part-time at, let's say, a library, university library. He's a library staff. So let's go through these three domains one by one. Jim, as a student, is hardworking and overly concerned about grades, and he's also overly concerned about how his teachers, his professors think about him. So a Big Five theorist might want to dissect these elements, the different elements that contribute to his life as a student, and say, okay, his hardworking part, the hardworking part of his personality is conscientiousness, and he's being overly concerned about grades, that's neuroticism, and he's being concerned with how the professors think about him, that's agreeableness. But if you say, okay, forget about that, I want to think about that domain of his life as a student, then all those so-called elements come into play and they combine, or they are synthesized. If they were ever independent from each other, when they meet, they interact with each other. So those three become three factors that are not independent in how they determine his life, how they shape and inform his life. Those tendencies interact. Now let's move to Jim as a friend. Jim as a friend likes to make new friends. So he's extrovert, and he likes to do new activities with his friends. So his openness interacts with his extroversion. They are not independent. Because he likes to try new activities, he has a better chance of meeting new friends. So the independence of extroversion and openness just completely goes away when you turn away from statistics to the concrete life of a human being. Finally, Jim in the library as a part-time worker, you can say it calms him down, and the work is predictable, and he likes his coworker. So again, extroversion, openness, and neuroticism, those are coming together. They are not separated. They come together. They're synthesized. There's a synthesis between them in determining Jim's life in a particular domain of life. So when we turn to concrete lives of individuals, instead of thinking about independent dimensions, we confront combination of tendencies. So how extroversion might be combined. Low or high extroversion might be combined with low or high agreeableness. And even in its abstract form, we have here at least 4 different combinations, 4 different eventualities. The point here is that when you think about what is actually happening in your life, what is actually happening in another person's life that you're in close contact with, you're less likely to think about the traits as separate things because they come together. You also notice that these traits are not the only way to divide your life. You might be more likely to think about your life as the different domains, like domains of friendship, the domain of your creative hobby, the domain of your romantic relationship, the domain of your friendships, and so on and so forth. So we don't need to let the personality traits divide our lives. That could be a very artificial way of thinking about our lives. So in general, let's reiterate, the traits or attributes exist as statistically independent variables in the aggregate data. Where they live is not in the lives of individuals. They live in the aggregate data as properties of the aggregate data. And they don't really enable us to make predictions about individuals. The predictions that they allow, to the extent that they allow some kind of prediction, even those predictions are about the aggregate data. So the correlation between variables or attributes don't say anything about any individual, with the exception of perfect correlation or perfect lack of correlation. When you know something about how openness correlates with other attributes in general in the aggregate data, you are not informed at all about singular individuals. If you like to explore this topic, especially in a critical manner, I would recommend several works by James Lamiel, including the article that I already mentioned, and including these two books, if you want to get deep into this topic. These books are inspired by William Stern, but the books are written by James Lamiel. Beyond Individual and Group Differences, and more recently, William Stern, A Brief Introduction to His Life and Work. All right, next time we will continue with the topic of the self. As always, if you like this series, please consider supporting with simple things like liking, commenting, and subscribing. With more serious, if you are interested in more serious support, you can check out my Patreon page. And that's all for now. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will speak with you next time.